The popular image of the aging, tyrannical Henry VIII, monarch of 6 wives and executions, obscures the man as he first came to the throne. In 1491, Henry was a physically imposing and intellectually curious boy. A product of the Renaissance, he excelled in Latin, music, and athletics. This unburdened upbringing was possible because he was never intended to rule, instead destined for the church or a supporting role. That burden belonged to his older brother, Arthur. As the designated heir, Arthur was raised within a rigid apparatus of dynastic expectation, tutored specifically for kingship, and betrothed to Catherine of Aragon almost as soon as he could walk. Their father, Henry VII, had won the crown not through lineage, but through the chaos of Bosworth Field in 1485, ending a long period of civil instability. That violent path to power produced a cautious, austere ruler. Henry VII prioritized consolidating a fragile dynasty over splendor. This defensive posture created significant emotional distance between the king, focused on fiscal security, and his son, drawn to Italian Renaissance culture. Henry's education as the spare provided him with Renaissance ideals that would allow him to position himself in direct opposition to his father's medieval caution. In April 1502, Arthur died suddenly at Ludlow Castle. Overnight, 11-year-old Henry became Prince of Wales and sole heir to the throne. Arthur's death immediately threatened the survival of the vital alliance with Spain, which had been anchored by his marriage. Returning Arthur's widow, Catherine of Aragon, meant losing her massive dowry. To preserve the alliance, a papal dispensation permitted her marriage to the young Henry. The tragedy at Ludlow Castle ended Henry's childhood of relative freedom, binding him directly to the high-stakes demands of the succession. Terrified of losing his final heir, Henry VII became increasingly protective, restricting the young prince's movements and public exposure. Henry spent much of his adolescence within the royal household under close paternal supervision, a period of constraint that stood in sharp contrast to the openness of his earlier years. The increasingly reclusive king relied on aggressive fiscal policies to extract wealth from the public and fill the royal treasury. These punitive practices were deeply resented, making his final years a period of intense public hostility toward the crown. Henry spent his final years as a prince witnessing the friction between a reclusive, unpopular monarch and a frustrated public. This period of restriction provided the direct lived experience that he would systematically reverse upon taking power. Henry VIII died in April 1509. His 17-year-old son ascended the throne as Henry VIII, signaling a departure from the previous reign. The new king presented himself as a generous and outward-looking prince, a deliberate contrast to his father's reclusive and financially exacting final years. His first political act was to order the arrest of Empson and Dudley, the 2 ministers who had carried out his father's most hated tax policies. Executing these men was a public announcement that the old regime's fiscal aggression was over, successfully distancing the young king from the unpopularity of his father. Just over a month after his accession, on June 11, 1509, Henry finalized his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Their joint coronation at Westminster Abbey displayed immense splendor, projecting a new, radiant monarchy. In its early years, the marriage was a genuinely affectionate partnership. Henry valued Catherine's political counsel as they presided over a court modeled on the chivalric ideals of the Renaissance. The prince, who was never intended for the throne, used the unique education of a royal spare to dismantle his father's legacy, launching a brief but influential golden age for the Tudor dynasty. When Henry VIII took the throne, he inherited a deeply well-filled treasury and a kingdom at absolute peace. His father had secured the Tudor dynasty through cautious, transactional diplomacy. But the young king had little interest in caution. He wanted to project power. Henry looked backward, craving the martial prestige and romanticized glory of historical warrior kings like Edward III and Henry V. He immediately pivoted England toward aggressive military expansion. Joining Pope Julius II's Holy League, Henry committed his country to war against France, personally leading an English force across the Channel for campaigns in 1512 and 1513. His army achieved a minor victory at the Battle of the Spurs and successfully captured the French towns of Therouanne and Tournai. Strategically, the territorial gains were modest, but domestically, they achieved exactly what Henry intended. The English public celebrated the victories, validating Henry's carefully cultivated image as a glorious, chivalric monarch. By 1520, the relationship with France shifted from battlefield combat to an incredibly elaborate diplomatic theater designed to cement a fragile peace between the two nations. This culminated in the Field of the Cloth of Gold, an extraordinary summit staged near Calais. The English crown spent heavily to construct temporary palaces and host days of lavish ceremonial display. The target of this display was the French monarch, King Francis I. Henry viewed him as a direct personal competitor in matters of youth, physical appearance, and reputation. Despite the staggering expense, the weeks of feasting and jousting produced almost no lasting diplomatic agreements. The early years of Henry's reign were defined by this glittering facade. He routinely deployed his vast treasury to project an aura of unmatched magnificence, prioritizing his personal rivalry and image over substantive statecraft. While the young king was across the Channel chasing military glory and hosting diplomatic parties, the actual machinery of the English government had to keep running. The day-to-day administration fell to Thomas Wolsey. Rising from relatively modest origins, Wolsey's extraordinary ability propelled him to the roles of Lord Chancellor, Archbishop of York, and a Cardinal of the Roman Church. For close to 2 decades, Wolsey completely managed England's foreign policy, domestic administration, and royal finance. He amassed vast personal wealth, constructing Hampton Court Palace as a physical monument to his status as the second most powerful man in the kingdom. The other pillar of Henry's government was his wife, Catherine of Aragon. When Henry left to invade France in 1513, he appointed Catherine to act as regent in his absence. She immediately faced a massive Scottish invasion of northern England, launched by James IV in support of France. Catherine oversaw the defense, culminating in the Battle of Flodden. The Scottish forces were crushed, and James IV was killed on the field. The royal marriage functioned as a highly effective political partnership. Henry's posturing on the continent was only possible because he relied on the administrative genius of his chief minister and the military competence of his foreign queen. Beneath the military campaigns and the diplomatic spectacle, a quiet, intensifying crisis was unfolding behind closed doors. This timeline chart maps Catherine's pregnancies throughout the 1510s. It reveals a devastating biological pattern: multiple miscarriages, stillbirths, and infants who died within weeks of birth. Out of all these attempts, only one child survived infancy, a daughter, Mary, born in February 1516. By the mid-1520s, Catherine was in her 40s and past any reasonable expectation of another pregnancy. Henry faced the stark mathematical reality that his only legitimate heir was female. For the English political class, the idea of a woman ruling in her own right was viewed as dangerously untested, and by many simply unacceptable. The memory of the Wars of the Roses was still fresh. Without a male heir, the stability Henry had inherited and Wolsey had maintained was almost guaranteed to collapse into another bloody dynastic civil war upon the king's death. Henry knew he was capable of siring a healthy boy. In 1519, his mistress Elizabeth Blount had given birth to a son, Henry Fitzroy. In a radical move in 1525, the king elevated the young boy to the dukedom of Richmond and Somerset. It was an unusually high honor for an illegitimate child. Courtiers and diplomats watched closely, interpreting the titles as a signal that Henry was testing the waters to name Fitzroy as his potential successor. But elevating a bastard to the throne was a legally uncertain proposition. It was a desperate half-measure that would invite exactly the kind of violent dynastic challenges Henry was trying to prevent. Henry had successfully conquered French towns and built a flawless, chivalric public image, only to find himself defeated by his own biology. By the second half of the 1520s, the court was consumed by a single issue, referred to with careful discretion as the king's great matter. The matter was Henry's absolute obsession with finding a way to dissolve his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, allowing him to contract a new marriage and finally produce a legitimate male heir. The pillars of his early success, Wolsey's administration and Catherine's loyalty, could not solve his succession crisis. To secure his legacy, Henry realized he would have to tear down the entire foundation of his kingdom. By the mid-1520s, King Henry VIII faced a mounting dynastic emergency. His lack of a male heir threatened to fracture the Tudor line, a crisis complicated by his intense attachment to a young woman at court named Anne Boleyn. Unlike her sister, who had previously been the king's mistress, Anne refused to take that role. She held out for marriage, a strategy that forced Henry to address his marital status as a matter of state. To end his 20-year marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Henry turned to a specific passage from Leviticus. He used this text to claim that marrying his brother's widow had cursed the union with childlessness from the start. This theological argument served as a convenient cover for personal desires. It moved the king's private infatuation out of the shadows of court life and into the realm of national religious consequence. Lord Chancellor Thomas Wolsey was tasked with securing an official annulment from Pope Clement VII, a mission that quickly collided with European power politics. Wolsey faced a geopolitical trap. Catherine of Aragon was the aunt of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. In 1527, Charles's forces sacked Rome and held the Pope as a virtual captive. Clement could not grant Henry's request without humiliating the emperor's aunt and risking further imperial wrath. This gridlock paralyzed the English legal system for years. For failing to deliver the annulment, Wolsey was stripped of his office, charged with treason, and died while traveling to face trial. With international diplomacy failing him, Henry realized that the only way to get what he wanted was to break the system entirely. Wolsey's downfall opened a path for a new circle of advisors who proposed shifting the entire basis of the king's authority. Thomas Cranmer, a Cambridge theologian, suggested that the validity of the king's marriage should be settled by academic experts rather than the Pope. Cranmer canvassed theologians at universities across Europe to build an intellectual case for England to act independently of papal jurisdiction. This academic campaign challenged the Pope's exclusive authority to interpret divine law for the English people, providing the intellectual groundwork for a total break from Rome. While Cranmer provided the theory, Thomas Cromwell provided the legislative force. Cromwell was an administrative genius who focused on the raw mechanics of power. Throughout the early 1530s, Cromwell moved a series of acts through Parliament that systematically stripped away papal authority over the English Church. The 1534 Act of Supremacy formally declared Henry supreme head of the Church of England, vesting all ecclesiastical authority in the crown. With this new power, Cranmer annulled the marriage to Catherine, as Henry had already secretly married a pregnant Anne Boleyn. This was a ruthless jurisdictional revolution. It was a calculated legal solution to a political problem driven by dynastic needs rather than theological change. The human cost of this revolution began with Catherine of Aragon. Despite the bloodshed and the break from Rome, everyday English religious life remained largely Catholic. The rituals and theology stayed remarkably similar to traditional practice. This was distinct from the Protestant Reformation led by Martin Luther in Europe, which focused on deep doctrinal changes. Henry did not seek a new religion. He sought a new wife and the absolute jurisdictional power to govern his kingdom without outside interference. By seizing control of the church to solve his own problems, Henry VIII inadvertently built the legal framework that his successors would eventually use to transform the soul of England.
Chapter 4.
In June 1533, Anne Boleyn was crowned Queen of England in a ceremony designed to project absolute triumph. To get to this moment, King Henry VIII had spent 7 years dismantling the nation's legal frameworks and upending its entire religious order. But the secret pregnancy that had finally forced the marriage did not yield the male heir Henry had bet his kingdom on. In September 1533, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. While public celebrations went ahead exactly as mandated by the crown, the mood inside the court was entirely different. The king was bitterly disappointed. Anne's position was precarious from the start. The sharp, assertive personality that had captivated Henry during his long courtship clashed with the passive, deferential behavior expected of a royal wife. Henry had fractured his realm specifically to secure a male dynasty, and he was left holding a female infant. Without a son, a silent timer began ticking on Anne's survival at court. Over the next few years, Anne suffered at least 2 miscarriages. All the while, public resentment simmered, with many citizens remaining fiercely loyal to Henry's deposed first wife, Catherine of Aragon. In January 1536, Catherine of Aragon died of illness at almost the exact moment Anne miscarried a male fetus. Seeing these events collide fractured Henry's patience. He became convinced this second marriage was condemned by God, mirroring the failure of his first. His attention quickly drifted. He became infatuated with a new woman at court, Jane Seymour, whose quiet deference offered a stark contrast to Anne's fiery demeanor. Henry no longer viewed Anne as his hard-won prize. She had become an obstacle to his royal lineage, one that he now actively wanted out of the way. Getting rid of a crowned queen required a specialized tool. The English justice system was adapted from a method of finding truth into a streamlined mechanism for executing the king's political will. Thomas Cromwell was the architect of this shift. Once Anne's political rival, Cromwell now acted with ruthless efficiency to orchestrate her permanent removal. Through April and May of 1536, Cromwell moved fast. He gathered testimony against the Queen, relying on evidence that was heavily coerced and deeply dubious by any standard of law. The charges were severe. Anne was accused of adultery with several courtiers, including a musician named Mark Smeaton, and of incest with her own brother, George Boleyn. The state apparatus convicted them all. This maneuver showed the English court that the law could be wielded as an instrument of state-sanctioned murder. The speed of the proceedings was dizzying. Despite the lack of credible evidence, Anne and the accused men were tried and convicted in a matter of weeks. On the 19th of May, Anne was brought to the scaffold at the Tower of London. She was beheaded by a specialized swordsman brought in from France, a method considered comparatively merciful. The king did not wait to mourn. Just 11 days after Anne's execution, Henry married Jane Seymour, clearing the slate for his desired male heir. A grim precedent had been set. If a marriage became politically inconvenient, the king could now resolve his domestic problems with the executioner's blade. The violence that started inside the court soon spilled out across the kingdom. Under Cromwell's direction, the crown initiated the dissolution of the monasteries, stripping England's religious institutions of their vast landholdings and wealth. The pace of this religious and economic upheaval provoked widespread outrage. In 1536, northern England erupted in the Pilgrimage of Grace, the largest popular uprising of Henry's entire reign. Faced with thousands of rebels, Henry resorted to calculation. He opened negotiations, offering assurances of clemency to convince the crowds to lay down their arms and go home. He had no intention of honoring those promises. Once the rebels dispersed, Henry reneged entirely, ordering the execution of hundreds of participants and local leaders. The willingness to kill former allies at court had expanded into a willingness to slaughter his own subjects in the streets to maintain absolute authority. Through this bloodshed, Henry finally reached his primary goal. In October 1537, Jane Seymour gave birth to a living son, Prince Edward, sparking immense celebration across the country. But the victory was brief. Less than 2 weeks later, Jane died from complications of childbirth. Henry had his male heir, but he had lost the wife who provided him. Contemporary accounts note that she was the only one of his 6 wives he genuinely mourned. Years later, he ensured he would be buried directly beside her here, at Windsor. The timeline from 1533 to 1537 left a staggering amount of collateral damage. A deposed first wife, an executed second wife and her courtiers, dismantled religious institutions, hundreds of slaughtered citizens, and a deceased third wife. Henry secured his male line. However, the events of this period stripped away any remnants of the chivalric young king he once was, leaving behind a hardened autocrat who secured his dynasty with broken laws and a massive toll of human life.
Chapter 5.
The image of Henry VIII as a vibrant Renaissance athlete died with Jane Seymour. By his late 40s, the king's physical reality was one of stark decay. A severe jousting injury from his earlier years had left him with a chronic leg ulcer. As it worsened, it caused him constant agony and severely limited his nobility. Yet, as his body failed, his political authority reached its absolute peak. He presided over a court fiercely divided between religious conservatives and reformists, holding complete, terrifying control over both factions. While Henry steadily lost command over his own body and domestic life, he was assembling a massive, cold machinery of state, an engine designed to outlive the man who commissioned it. That machinery was largely designed by his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell. In 1540, Cromwell orchestrated Henry's fourth marriage to secure a political alliance with German Protestant princes, building a counterweight to the looming threat of a Catholic coalition between France and the Holy Roman Empire. Henry agreed to the match based entirely on a portrait painted by Hans Holbein the Younger. The composed, regal figure thoroughly convinced the king. The reality of their first meeting was disastrous. Henry found her completely unappealing, and after just 6 months, a marriage was annulled on grounds of a prior betrothal contract and the fact that it was never consummated. Anne accepted the situation with remarkable pragmatism. She received a generous settlement of properties and the honorary title of the king's sister, surviving the ordeal comfortably. Thomas Cromwell, however, did not. Cromwell's conservative enemies used the failure of the Cleves marriage to have him arrested for treason. He was executed in July 1540, on the exact same day Henry married his fifth wife. That new bride was Catherine Howard, a teenager and a cousin to the executed Anne Boleyn. Her youth and vivacity captivated the aging king, securing a massive political victory for the conservative factions at court. This conservative victory aligned with Henry's own personal theology. Even though he had broken definitively with the Pope, he feared 6 Articles of 1539. The English Church was now separated from Rome, but the scales remained heavily weighed down by traditional Catholic doctrines, explicitly reaffirming practices like transubstantiation and clerical celibacy. The domestic stability the conservatives hoped for quickly collapsed. Barely a year into the marriage, evidence surfaced that Catherine had engaged in sexual relationships with a courtier named Thomas Culpeper, both before and during her marriage to the king. Contemporary accounts describe Henry as genuinely and deeply devastated by the revelation. In February 1542, Catherine was executed, following the exact same path to the scaffold as her cousin Anne 6 years earlier. While his personal life spiraled through chaotic tragedy, his institutional control did not waver. The king managed his conservative English church with the same ruthless efficiency he applied to his failing marriages. In July 1543, Henry married for the 6th and final time. Catherine Parr was an intelligent, well-educated widow with reformist sympathies. She brought a companionate stability perfectly suited to the needs of an increasingly infirm monarch. She was also a highly capable political operator, serving briefly and effectively as regent to manage the state while Henry was away on military campaigns in France. While Parr managed the court, the state apparatus Cromwell had built reached its climax. Throughout the 1530s and 40s, the crown completed the dissolution of the monasteries, systematically dismantling the physical infrastructure of the Catholic Church. This massive wealth transferred directly from the destroyed monasteries into the royal treasury, funding Henry's military ambitions. But the crown quickly sold these properties, the wealth splintering outward into the hands of a rapidly expanding new class of gentry. This redistribution of land proved to be the most lasting consequence of his reign. By transferring the church's vast estates to this new class, Henry altered the English social structure far more effectively than any theological decree. At the time of his death, Henry left behind a deeply contradictory religious settlement. The English Church had violently rejected papal authority, yet stubbornly maintained traditional Catholic rituals and doctrine. The man himself was volatile and physically broken, but the autocratic state apparatus he constructed over his final decade was highly organized and fully functional. Beyond the machinery of state, his final wife secured the dynasty itself. Catherine Parr successfully reconciled the king with his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, both of whom had been declared illegitimate during the marital upheavals of the 1530s. Parr took direct interest in their welfare, specifically fostering the intense intellectual development and early reformist sympathies of the young Elizabeth. It is the final irony of his reign. The king, who spent his last years resisting the Protestant tide, had systematically built the wealth, the state apparatus, and, through Catherine Parr, the education of the specific heir who would ensure England's Protestant future.
Chapter 6.
In Tudor political theory, the monarch possessed two distinct forms: a physical body of mortal flesh and an immortal body politic that represented the continuous state. During the final decade of Henry's life, severe cracks began to show in both. Court memory still held on to the image of the slender, athletic Renaissance prince who had inherited the throne in 1509. By the 1540s, that man was gone. This is Henry's surviving field armor. It records a waist measurement exceeding 50 inches, the physical proof of a king who had become severely obese. His diet consisted overwhelmingly of meat, lacking the fresh produce required for baseline health. He likely suffered from type 2 diabetes, alongside a chronic, agonizing ulcer on his leg, the lingering result of a severe jousting accident years prior. The ulcer refused to heal. It caused him intense pain, restricted his physical movement, and, according to contemporary accounts, produced a foul odor that permeated the daily life of the court around him. This medical reality presented an immediate geopolitical danger. The absolute power of the English state rested entirely on this failing human body, whose only guarantee for the future was a single, fragile male heir. Faced with his fading physical vitality, Henry lashed out. He needed to project an illusion of absolute, unassailable strength to his rivals abroad before his time ran out. He turned his attention to foreign policy, launching massively expensive military campaigns to mask his vulnerability on the world stage. English forces opened two fronts in the 1540s. They crossed the Channel to capture the French city of Boulogne, while simultaneously orchestrating a series of devastating incursions northward into Scotland. The Scottish campaign earned a grim nickname, the Rough Wooing. It was a brutal, ultimately unsuccessful attempt to force a dynastic marriage between the infant Mary, Queen of Scots, and Henry's own son, Edward. While capturing a French city stroked the king's pride, the combined cost of these dual offensives wiped out the treasury. To fund the war effort, Henry took drastic domestic measures. He began liquidating substantial portions of monastic lands the crown seized during the dissolution. When selling off land wasn't enough, the government turned to the national currency. The crown debased the coinage. Mints were ordered to reduce the silver content in the coins and replace it with cheaper base metals, allowing the treasury to artificially stretch its remaining funds. This chart tracks the silver content of English currency against national inflation rates. The repeated debasement triggered severe inflation, creating deep economic damage that outlasted Henry's reign entirely. In his obsession with projecting martial dominance abroad, the king systematically cannibalized the financial foundation of his own realm. As the treasury emptied, paranoia within the royal court intensified. The factions surrounding the king knew his death was approaching, and they braced for control. The division was ideological. Religious conservatives, led by figures like Stephen Gardiner, fought to maintain traditional Catholic rituals within the independent English Church. Opposing them were the Protestant reformers, aligned with Archbishop Cranmer and the Seymour family. The urgency driving this factionalism was the terrifying fragility of the Tudor bloodline. It rested entirely on Prince Edward, who was still a child. Whoever controlled his regency council would dictate the theology of England for a generation. Amidst this maneuvering, Queen Catherine Parr provided a stabilizing influence backstage. She quietly encouraged Henry to mend his fractured relationships with his older, previously disinherited daughters. This reconciliation paved the way for Henry's most vital piece of dynastic legislation, the Third Succession Act of 1543. The act formally restored Mary and her half-sister Elizabeth to the line of succession as pragmatic backups. Under the strict letter of the law, their parents' annulments meant they were technically still illegitimate, but the necessity of dynastic survival required an heir. By prioritizing the continuation of his bloodline over past legal grievances, Henry established the ultimate insurance policy. This legal maneuver kept the Tudor dynasty alive for the rest of the century. By 1546, Henry's physical deterioration was absolute. Confined to a rotting body, he was largely immobile, relying on mechanical assistance to move between rooms. Yet contemporary accounts noted that trapped inside Cal's ruined frame was a terrifyingly sharp intellect. He retained close personal control over all government business. He used that formidable will to dominate the room. Even from his bed, he kept the circling, ambitious factions completely in check right up until the final weeks of his life. When he died in 1547, the realm he left behind was a paradox. The nation financially exhausted, the currency stripped of value, and its court deeply fractured. His physical decay nearly pulled the English state down with it, but through sheer political intellect, he successfully engineered the fragile succession framework that defined the next era of history.
Last chapter 6.
On January 28, 1547, Henry VIII died at Whitehall Palace. He was 55, having ruled England for nearly 38 years. For 3 days, his Privy Council kept the king's death a strict secret. The reform-leaning Seymour faction used this blackout window to arrange the transition of power. They needed time to secure their positions before the news went public. The entire Tudor government now rested entirely on the shoulders of Henry's only legitimate son, Edward VI, a 9-year-old boy. Henry had spent decades tearing the English establishment apart to guarantee a strong patriarchal succession. Yet he left his radically altered nation resting on a deeply fragile foundation. He severed England from Rome, forced royal supremacy over the church, and executed queens, all to clear the path for this single male heir. Confident in his victory, Henry arranged to be buried at Windsor Castle, beside Jane Seymour, the mother of his precious son. He went to his grave believing his grand succession plan was secure. The historical reality that followed over the next decade proved otherwise. Did this destructive, lifelong pursuit actually achieve the permanent legacy he intended, or did it engineer something else entirely? The primary goal of Henry's life collapsed almost immediately. Edward was a sickly child and died at 15 years old, extinguishing the Tudor male line. A desperate 9-day attempt by the Regency government to divert the crown to a Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey, failed entirely. In 1553, Mary I ascended the throne. She was the elder Catholic daughter Henry had previously gone to extraordinary lengths to declare illegitimate. Over a 5-year reign, Mary waged a brutal campaign to forcefully reverse her father's Protestant Reformation, executing hundreds of heretics and earning the historical epithet Bloody Mary. But Mary died childless. Her brief rule represented a violent, chaotic unraveling of Henry's carefully engineered religious and dynastic plans. In 1558, the crown passed to Henry's younger daughter, Elizabeth I. Elizabeth was the daughter of Anne Boleyn. Her mother's mere existence had catalyzed the English Reformation, yet Henry had formally denied Elizabeth's legitimacy for much of her childhood. She would rule for 45 years. Elizabeth stabilized the Protestant settlement of the English Church and presided over a widely celebrated cultural golden age. Henry's Tudor dynasty was ultimately saved and immortalized entirely by the women he had sidelined and tried to destroy. The institutional legacy of Henry's reign traces back to a redefined relationship between the crown, parliament, and religious authority. This chart maps the dissolution of the monasteries, illustrating the proportional drain of wealth and land moving from the church to the crown. By stripping the church's assets, the crown created a path for the gentry to gain significant social and economic power. This redistribution of land and capital reshaped English social structure in ways that outlasted every religious controversy of Henry's reign. To enact the Reformation, Henry turned Parliament into an administrative engine, using legislative statutes to break with Rome. This established a precedent. If Parliament could dismantle the Church, it had the legislative authority to reshape the state itself. This legislative engine would generate friction for the next 100 years, culminating in a civil war that saw the monarchy temporarily abolished. When Charles I was executed following that conflict, his remains were placed at Windsor Castle, inside the exact same vault as Henry VIII. The two kings lie side by side, the architect of royal supremacy and the monarch destroyed by the authority of Parliament. Henry broke the world to secure his dynasty's future, but the very tools he used to build his power provided the legal framework that would eventually be used to dismantle it.